Okay, welcome everybody as we're filtering in. As you can see, I am very excited for our guest today, Brian Lauritzen. Hi, Brian.
Hello, how's it going?
Oh, it's going great. So we'll go over all the rules of the hour in a little bit, but as a reminder for everybody, if you have any questions or comments for Brian throughout the hour, there's a Q&A button on your screen somewhere. And you can feel free to use that. You can use the chat function, and I will try to get to as many of the questions and comments as we can.
No topic off limits.
You may regret that. Yay! So welcome everybody. As I said before, I'm so excited to have Brian Lauritzen from KUSC joining us. Hi Brian, how's it going?
Going great.
So that opening clip was obviously Gustavo Dudamel. It was the Strauss Chich Chach Polka with the Simone Bolivar Orchestra. And we're gonna get more into that later, which I'm very excited to talk to Brian about. For those of you, I'm sure all of you recognize Brian's voice from KUSC, but for those of you who don't know about him personally, I just want to give you a brief recap. He is one of the star hosts of KUSC. He's a host of Inside the Music with the LA Phil, the Classical Anti-Road Rage Melody, which I know brings me a lot of comfort on my drive, and more recently, the At Home With series that started during the pandemic. He's been broadcast internationally on NPR, American Public Media. And in addition to his work on radio, he also hosts and introduces live programs by many of the top musical organizations in Southern California, like the LA Phil, the Celestina Society, where he's a resident artist along with me, Philharmonic Society of Orange County, and of course, the Pacific Symphony. I also just have to say he has an amazing collection of quirky lapel pins and socks, which I'm very jealous about. So anyway, Brian, thanks so much for coming on.
My great pleasure. And yeah, I totally miss all of these experiences. As you're listing them off, I'm like, man, I haven't given a pre-concert talk since March. And yeah, the connection, these Zoom things are really important right now, but boy, do we miss the concert hall and the face-to-face in-person stuff.
Yes, 100%. And I have to say, one of my favorite memories from recent seasons was when you came and did the sort of co-hosting with Carl of our Scheherazade concerts, either last season or the season before. It was really fun.
I love that piece. And I mean, Carl and I, we haven't done a ton together, but I just feel like we hit it off, had such a great rapport, and he's such a great storyteller, and we just kind of bounced off each other. We planned everything out, and then he's like, you know, wherever you want to go is fine. Like, I'll follow you and I'll bounce off you. And it was great. So
yeah, that was awesome. So as a reminder to everybody, if you weren't here when I said it before, feel free to use the Q&A feature if you have any questions for Brian. If you have any comments on what we're talking about or questions, add them in the chat, and I'll do my best to get to them throughout the hour. So Brian, I'm very curious, when you were growing up, was there a lot of music around you growing up? Like, how did you amass such a breadth of musical knowledge?
Totally. Music was everywhere growing up for me. So my dad was a choral director. He just retired this year, actually. And my mom, in addition to being an elementary school teacher and later administrator, she was a pianist and an organist. So I grew up surrounded by music. We listened to almost exclusively classical music in the home. Not for any dogmatic reasons, just because, it's what we liked the best. And at age 5, I started playing the cello. My older sister had started playing the violin a couple years prior. We did piano lessons, and when I quit piano after a couple of years, my mom said, "Oh, you're gonna regret this." And she was right, if a little passive aggressive, but music has always been a part of my life. And I just have loved the stories behind the music, getting into why it is what it is, and who the composers were and what their backgrounds were and what their interests were as well.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting, a few weeks ago, one of our mixers was about music education and how to get young people who may have some natural aptitude for it, or whose parents want to get them just sort of generally interested and knowledgeable about it, into music. And I'm curious, like, how did your parents do that for you, and do it in a way that sort of inspired that sort of curiosity, or do you think that really came from yourself?
I mean, I don't know exactly how to answer that the best way. I think curiosity is something that has to be developed, and it has to be encouraged. And I certainly had that. And curiosity is something that can be stifled. And so I feel like certainly with my folks, it was welcomed, it was encouraged. And then I had a really good series of teachers in the world of music. In particular, my cello teacher through end of elementary school all the way through high school and into undergrad, was not a strongly, I'm using this word again, dogmatic, you have to stick to this particular line of pedagogy. He was, what inspires you, kind of a person, and it inspired a curiosity in me. And he said, there's not a wrong path to discover a musical sensibility. Yes, there are certain pieces that you have to play, but there's not a wrong way to approach all of it. And so, I think the curiosity element was instilled in me from a very young age, and it's thankfully still there.
Yeah. And were you always interested, not just curiosity in terms of performance, but did you always find that you were curious about, like, the backgrounds of composers and of pieces, and sort of learning more about those aspects of it?
Yeah, I think the stories are just so interesting. And I'm the kind of person who, like, if I'm interested in something, then I get, like, kind of obsessive about it. And so, like, for example, music, I'm really interested in it, so I'm gonna, like, read it as much as possible. And now, like, my job is to tell stories and connect people with classical music. And so I'm always looking for new ways to do that. You know, for the same reason, like I like sports and I get really obsessive about like watching and learning and reading stats and storytelling around sports and what motivates great athletes. You know, similarly, wine, food, that sort of thing. Like if I'm interested in something, I'm probably going to be a little obsessive about it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to be. So
debatable.
So when was the first inkling that you had that, you know, something along the lines of radio hosting and being involved in that aspect of music would be something that you might want to pursue?
I grew up listening to public radio, and I would call our local classical radio station. They had a request hour in the evenings as a kid, and I would request. You know, this is back when, you know, you don't have all of the music at your fingertips, right? And so I would request to hear music that I knew of but didn't have a recording of, to see if I wanted to like buy it. And so like that connection to you know, someone on the other end of a speaker, and just the relationship that you can build through, even when you can't see someone. That was always something that I was interested in. And then just, you know, growing up around public radio, listening to public radio, we were big Garrison Keillor fans, and just the way that he could spin a story. And, you know, we know that he didn't script anything that he wrote. It was all just like, you know, and he created these masterful stories, just, and let the imagination run wild. And, you know, that element of radio is just something that I really was always interested in. And then, you know, as a pretty young kid, we would take road trips in the summer, and my folks would say, you know, oh, you can choose the music that we listen to. And so I would have, you know, CDs and cassettes in the car, and I would announce to the car,
that's amazing.
You're gonna hear, you know, Bruckner 3 or something, and, you know, then an hour later we're still driving, and that's the next piece. So I guess looking back, it was sort of inevitable that I end up doing what I'm doing now, but it was born out of a love for storytelling and the music.
That's awesome. And I think what you were saying about sort of your relationship with public radio, you know, sort of also is really important, because I think it shows sort of the amazing benefits that radio can have, and that connection can have, in particular on young people. Like, I mean, I remember similar stories growing up of, you know, that I would wake up and the radio station that would be my alarm would be the classical station. And I would always get so excited when there was a piece that caught my ear that I didn't know. And I'd like wait for the announcer to say what it was and scribble it on a pad so I could go like buy it later.
Yeah, and it's different now. I mean, like podcasts are more where the younger audiences are going. And that's great. Like there's nothing wrong with that. Our audience is is very skewed heavily 45 and up. And like people say, well, what are you doing to reach out to younger listeners? And the answer is, well, we want a younger audience, but we love our audience of all ages. And a lot of people come to classical music later in life, and there's nothing wrong with that. So we celebrate anyone who wants to be a part of our audience. And I think there is something special about folks who have listened to the station for decades and decades, and we hear so many stories. We had a listener write in last week who said, I've been listening to the station since the Taft administration. And now that was an exaggeration, obviously, because what are the dates of Taft? But you know, we have people who say that, you know, they've listened. We went on the air in 1946, and we've had people who have been listening since almost the beginning. And I just think that's it's really special. It's so cool.
That's amazing. So once you realized that you know, had an interest in this, you know, I feel like this is one of those things, it's not like you can just, not like a cello where you can go get a cello and start practicing. It's like, I imagine getting into, you know, your first experience actually hosting a radio show is a little more, I don't know, complicated, formal. I'm just curious, when was the first time you got a chance to really like try it out?
Yeah, there was a college station where I went to school near Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it's a classical music radio station, and that's where I got my start. And basically, like it was, there's two paths in. You can either come with a deep knowledge of classical music and you can learn broadcasting, or you can come as a broadcaster and learn classical music. Neither is easy. I happened to come from the world of classical music, and I thought, oh, there's no way I'm going to learn all the technical stuff. I'm not going to know which buttons to push and whatever, but you learn. And I basically got asked to be on that college station because I was a music major and a broadcasting major. And they said, well, you know, you've got to come on the radio because you know how to pronounce all the names. And I was like, well, I do, most of them. So if you can teach me how to do the technical stuff, then great. But you know, broadcasting is more than just pushing the right buttons. Broadcasting is a really specific skill set of storytelling. In particular, radio, where you're painting a picture for people where you can't see anything, and they can't even see your facial expressions. They can't see if you have a wry smile on your face as you're telling a story and you're being sort of tongue in cheek, or if you're being super serious. So it's both ways of coming at it are in their own unique ways, challenging, but a fun challenge. Either way you come at it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And then how did you make the journey from Chattanooga to Los Angeles?
Yeah, I did an internship at NPR when Performance Today was with National Public Radio. They have since jettisoned all of their classical music programming, unfortunately, except for a little bit of online stuff. But that was where I was really thinking like, oh man, broadcasting is what I want to do and not, you know, cello. So I came out to Los Angeles. My girlfriend at the time was studying PT here in the area, and I didn't want to keep doing a long distance relationship. So I came out here, contacted the radio station basically through a contact from my NPR internship days, and met Gail Eichenthal that way. And it was, I gave her a tape of my work, and as soon as something came open, I was able to start working at KUSC. So.
That's amazing. And the rest is history. So you mentioned that people usually come at it from either the classical angle, like with that background, or the broadcasting background. I mean, it sounds like you had some of both. But I'm just curious, especially coming from a largely classical training background into radio hosting, like what sorts of training then goes into it? And particularly when you're coming into an operation as big and sort of well-known as KUSC.
So I mean, I think like the most important thing, and this goes for if you're just doing public speaking or talking about music at a concert or something, it's all about the audience. It's all about how does this music connect with the audience, and what are points of connection. So you'll notice my background is a little potentially provocative. I don't know. It's all these composers with their faces scribbled out. Why does this music from decades and centuries ago by a bunch of dead people, how does it connect with us today in 2020? And to me, like, that's the question that I'm always asking. So I'm looking for stories about the music. I'm looking for elements of the music that relate to our lives today. So like, for example, with Scheherazade, you know, Scheherazade is an old story, and it's what, 150-year-old piece of music, right? How does that connect with our day? Well, here's someone who told stories with a cliffhanger so that she wouldn't get killed. So stories with a cliffhanger, that's an element of this story that can connect with us today, right? Like, have you ever had the experience of watching a show on Netflix and it ends and you want to see the next one, and it like either automatically queues it up and you're ready to go, or like you're like, okay, I was going to go to bed, but I need to know what happens next. Like, that's something that we can all relate to. And that's exactly what Scheherazade is she told a story, and she made the Sultan want to know what happened next, but you know, they had to go to bed and live another day, and eventually she, you know, she told enough stories that he spared her life, or she earned her life, I should say, by that way. But like little elements of that, like that's not like, I don't feel like I'm forcing a connection there. It's just, that's something about the music and something about our time, and you bring those two together and it's like, oh yeah, makes sense. So.
And then what about on a technical level in terms of broadcasting? Were you already really pretty familiar with how everything worked, like the technology, or was that also something that took some getting used to in terms of feeling comfortable and being able to like speak and say what you want to say while also managing whatever you have to manage?
Yeah, I mean, the technology both is super old and always changing. So, I mean, there's always been a microphone, there's always been an on button and a fader to adjust the volume. That part is always the same. The software can always be changing. For example, 3 or 4 years ago, we changed our entire operations software. We don't play any CDs, we don't play any records, we don't play any cassettes. Everything is digitized. And that's just, you know, if you have a scratched CD, nobody wants to hear a malfunctioning recording. They just want to hear music. So, you know, we digitized everything years ago. But 3 or 4 years ago, we changed the software that we use to play back the music. And the whole interface changed. And so they had to set up for us a workstation a month before we changed to this new software. There was a workstation set up in the office where we would each have assigned time periods to just practice a show with the new software, so that by the time we go live on the air with this new automation software, we don't make a mistake. So I was actually the guinea pig for that. I was the first person to go live on the air with the new software. And you are on edge, but eventually, you know, 4 hours a day, every day, you get pretty comfortable pretty quick.
Yeah, well, that's what another thing I was going to ask was like, do you ever get nervous in general before you have to start a particular broadcast, or do you find that you're comfortable enough now? I mean, aside from new technology, but like, yeah, is it ever sort of this like sort of a stage fright equivalent that you just sort of have to get used to?
What about for you?
I'm always nervous, whether I'm performing or not.
Really? Yeah.
No,
So, like, I mean, I think yes and no. I mean, there's the big moments, and you definitely get up for those. For my show every day, I wouldn't say necessarily. But you know, for example, 11 years and 4 days ago was Gustavo's debut as the conductor of the LA Phil, and we broadcast that live from the Hollywood Bowl. You know, big moment. 60 Minutes was there filming backstage. You know, and so I'm, you know, sitting there at the broadcast table, like John Williams walks by. You know, Jack Black for some reason was there. And you know, we're getting ready to go on the air, and I'm like, okay, yeah, this is a big moment. Like, don't screw this one up. So yeah, there's definitely moments where you're feeling the adrenaline pumping.
yeah, well, and sort of along those lines, you mentioned that one of the advantages of coming from the classical background is that you already knew a lot of the pronunciations and, you know, the various names, but obviously there are always more obscure ones or new ones. And I've always wondered how, like, do you have like a guide for those? How do you like do that in the moment? Is that something that has to be planned very carefully so you make sure that you're saying the official pronunciation?
Yeah, I mean, that is part of show prep. is to know how to pronounce everything. For example, tomorrow I have a conductor on my show whose name I didn't know. And so I had to go look him up. I can't remember off the top of my head, I apologize, but it was a name I had never seen before. And so first of all, like what you do is you email around to your colleagues, hey, does anyone know how to pronounce this? Usually someone will. Jim Treda knows how to pronounce just about everyone's name.
That seems about right.
But I've helped him out a couple of times too, though. We all help each other out with pronunciations. But if nobody knows, then the next step is, okay, what nationality is this person? What nationality is their name? And then what are the rules for that particular language? However, you can't always rely on that, because if you did, then you would say Pierre Boulez, and it's Pierre Boulez. So then, next step is, can you find anywhere a recorded interview with this person where they introduce them and say their name? If not, what about, can you find someone else with the same name? And there's a great website called Forvo, Forvo.com, which has native speakers from whatever country, pronouncing almost every word, actually, difficult to pronounce names. And so if all of that fails, then you just make your best guess. And the cool thing about our audience is there's going to be someone out there who probably knows. And like, I love hearing from people. Like if I don't pronounce something right, like I want to pronounce it right. So if someone writes in and said, you idiot, why didn't you say it this way? Well, great. Like, I want to know, like, so I love getting that feedback too. Like when we don't get it right.
Yeah, that's really cool. Sorry. My dog is very excited right now. So I'm curious, because I feel like your voice is so recognizable as being one of the main hosts on KUSC. And I'm curious, like, do you ever, because it's radio and people maybe don't see you as often as they hear you, do you ever have moments where you're in public and maybe they don't recognize you until you speak, and then they're like, recognize you from the radio?
Not often, although context certainly helps. So at a concert hall, I'll be more likely to be recognized within the classical music community. I think right now, though, if anyone has seen my headshots versus my pandemic hair, like, I don't think I would get recognized anywhere by my visage. But one time, my wife and I were in line at IKEA, and the person in front of us did recognize my voice and turned around and asked, "Oh, are you Brian from KUSC?" But I think still, even then, it was just because I think we were talking about Mahler. So again, there was a context clue there for them. It doesn't happen all that often.
So that's very cool. We did have a question relating to this. Oh yeah, so Teddy, hi Teddy, wants to know, first of all, she says she loves your anti-road rage picks. And she wants to know if the KUSC hosts get to actually interact much.
We did before isolation, certainly. And we have done a pretty good job of staying connected on Zoom during these times. In fact, right at the beginning, when we were all just trying to figure out, like, how are we going to run a radio station from closets and spare bedrooms and attics and basements, we actually got together every single day. And we don't do that anymore. We don't need to, but yeah, it's certainly in the before times, we do. Alan and I are really tight, Jennifer and I as well. But yeah, we do get a chance to interact quite a bit. And I love everyone's different perspective on music, because we all come with our own point of view. And to just sort of share that amongst ourselves, I think is interesting, certainly, and for me, helpful.
Yeah. And Fiona wants to know, well, first of all, she says, I'm always impressed by the way you finish your broadcast right on time. How do you do that when recordings vary from conductor to conductor? And I want to know that too.
Yeah, so the music is programmed in advance, and we have a list of um, talk time and music time, and you have to keep track of your talk time, and you can't go over. We do build in a couple of fail safes over the course of, for my shift, which is 4 hours. There will be at various points in the playlist that has been pre-populated, there will be optional pieces. So you have to keep track of where you're at in the hour. And if you feel like, you know, I'm going to need more time, then you can drop an optional piece. Or if you don't need extra time, you leave it in. So there's usually 2 of those per shift. I will say that it's a little more difficult now when we're working from home because we're not using the fancy automation software that I was talking about a few moments ago. That fancy software, as you go along live, it has your talk time there built into the interface. And so you just see it. And so you start at the beginning of a shift, you've got like 16 minutes. And then it counts down and you realize, okay, now I've got 13 minutes, now I've got 10. You get into the last hour and you've got like 3 minutes to go and you're figuring it out, like, okay, I think I can do it. I don't think I need to drop anything. But it takes so much bandwidth to run that software that we can't do that at home on our, you know, consumer grade Spectrum or AT&T internet. So
Has that been like, were you able to sort of get back into the swing of monitoring it yourself pretty quickly once you were at home?
Yeah, you just write it out ahead of time and then you subtract it. You do it manually, like the old days. Yeah.
So
and they give us more optional pieces too.
Okay, like, that makes sense. Yeah. And speaking of the pieces, how much input do you get on the programming, and does it depend on the show? How does that work, and like how far ahead of time is it set?
It's set about a week in advance, and we have a music programming policy, aesthetic policy that we follow pretty closely, and we review that about every 6 months. Why every 6 months when it's the same old classical music? The music is the same, but our zeitgeist changes very quickly. And so we want to reflect our community. We want to reflect the time we're living in. And so we regularly go back to, it's a document. And we go back and we look at it and we say, you know, what do we want to adjust? Do we need more familiarity, more hits right now? Do we need more discovery right now? And it is that balance between, you know, everyone's favorites versus what's out there that doesn't get played enough, and what kind of musical discovery can we share with the audience. Personally, so we have a music programming team. They do all of the programming for the station. But personally, as hosts, we absolutely have input in a couple of different ways. At any point, we can say, hey, I'd like to have this piece on my show. Can you make that happen? And they can tell us yes or no. We have input when we're up against a timing issue. So like, say we dropped all the optional pieces, but the show's still going to run overtime. Then, you know, we have dispensation from management to say, like, swap out a piece, make it fit. But, you know, within the guidelines of the aesthetic. So like, you know, don't drop a Haydn symphony and play Stockhausen, for example.
Could be fun.
It could be fun. It might kill the audience, but I mean, I'm into it, but you know, I don't think a lot of people would be. So, so there's flexibility within a pretty structured framework. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, totally. And it's sort of, I'm curious also along these lines, like, sorry, kind of very active puppy here. What are some of your favorite ways to discover new composers and new pieces that maybe you didn't know before, apart from hosting the shows and hearing music there?
Yeah, talking to people, asking people, what are they listening to? What do they like? What do you think I should be listening to? So against perhaps my better judgment, I love Twitter. I think Twitter's great. I have a really awesome community on Twitter that is such a great resource for me. And so, for example, I can pose a question on Twitter and I can say like, and I can be very specific, like what piano trios do you think I should be listening to right now? Or what 19th century French symphonies maybe have I missed? Like all of them besides Franck, right? So I like to ask people what they're excited about musically, because then, then you can also get the why, rather than just sort of wading through a whole bunch of random recordings on Spotify. So like for me, like that's the joy of radio too, is that like it's all about curation, right? And so I like to curate music for other folks, and I like people to share music with me. The personal element of it to me is very important.
Yeah, and I love the idea of getting recommendations from Twitter for exactly why you said, like getting the reasons behind it, and it seems like it's probably a lot more efficient.
It's not all bad on that website too.
But I was gonna say maybe I need to get a Twitter. I don't know.
You don't have to. Wait until after November 3rd.
Yeah, I will definitely do that. So in stepping back from the day-to-day programming, how do you design the actual programs themselves? Are those things that like, can you go with an idea that you have to KUSC and pitch something, or is it sort of the other way around and they see what you might be interested in that they have?
Yes, to both of those, all of those. Yeah, they're interested in what we're interested in. It doesn't necessarily mean like if I have an idea for a show, they're like, great, go do it. It's very collaborative, and basically the real filter is how does it serve the audience, and how does it celebrate classical music, how does it connect people to classical music? Those are sort of our filters for why we would do a show. And so my question that I always ask about even not just a show, but just even like when I open the microphone and talk about a piece of music is it's like why. The question is why this piece right now? Why should anyone care? Why did we pick this? And if this music is, as we like to say, timeless, then we ought to be able to speak to that. We ought to be able to connect to this music in our time, music from hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, I love that. And in particular, the series that you have done during the pandemic, the At Home With series. Can you tell us a little bit about how that got started?
That was so cool. Gustavo Dudamel called us up and was like, I want to do a radio show. This was like right at the very beginning of what are we calling it now? Quarantine, isolation time, like early mid-March. So my birthday, March 13, was my last day in the office. And by late March, we had heard from the LA Phil and from Gustavo, specifically Gustavo said, it's going to be months before I'm going to be able to perform, but I want to share music with people that can uplift and inspire them and also help us feel connected during a time of isolation. So obviously, now feels a whole lot different from what March and April and May felt like, right? So we don't feel quite as isolated and alone, I think, right now, because we have, especially Orange County has opened up even more than Los Angeles County has. And so, we're feeling less isolated, but right at the very beginning, it was like, we're all by ourselves in our homes, and we had all these tickets to all these concerts, and we're grieving the loss of live performance. And so the show was really designed to have a collective experience in isolation of music that uplifts and inspires. So it was really like, we're gonna stay away from like the Barber Adagio for strings for now, and we want like really positive, upbeat music. And so I think the first piece that Gustavo picked all the music, and then once we figured out the tech, which was a whole other thing, and included, I got to teach him how to use Zoom, which I think I will put that on my CV. But, you know, once we got all the tech sorted out, you know, I asked him basically, what is it about this music that inspires you or us during this moment of isolation? And so, like, I think the first piece was like Mozart Jupiter Symphony, you know, last movement, and it's just this buoyant, uplifting piece. And then along the way, he introduced me to music that I didn't know, which I'm like, you know, that's so great. And one of them is this like Tritsch Tratsch polka thing. So we started the broadcast this evening with Johann Strauss Jr. Tritsch Tratsch polka, which means chit chat polka, which this is an old Viennese piece that like gets on all of those New Year's concerts with the Vienna Philharmonic. It's like, it's fun, it's light, it's bubbly, it's like a glass of champagne, and it's pretty familiar. And Gustavo said, have you heard Paul Descen's arrangement of the Tritsch Tratsch polka? Paul Descen is a Venezuelan composer and a good friend of Gustavo's. And I said, no, what is it? And so I thought we'd share that with you this evening. But I don't know, Ben, if you want to play a little bit of the original old Vienna sound first, just to get the original in our ears.
Yeah, so I'll play us about a minute of the original Johann Strauss Jr., and then we'll shift and you guys can hear the sort of fun version.
How
Okay,
great is
that
that?
was amazing. So cool.
You can't not smile when you listen to it, first of all. And one thing that I love about that piece of music in particular, and especially as it relates to this time of isolation, is this is music that like seamlessly goes from the world of old Vienna to the dance halls of, he included a Cuban dance, a Mexican dance, and a Venezuelan dance in the various musical styles there. And it just goes between those two worlds so seamlessly. And it's just a beautiful metaphor for like, we are musical creatures. When it comes down to it, it doesn't matter where we come from. It doesn't matter who we are. There's music in us, and how it does it, like old Vienna versus a dance hall in Havana, you can bring that together. And it just sort of is a beautiful metaphor for that in my mind.
Yeah, I love that. And it's just done so seamlessly. It really feels like, oh, of course it's supposed to be that way.
Yeah.
So I mentioned at the top, and we've touched on a little bit, that in addition to hosting on KUSC on radio, that you do a lot of pre-concert talks and hosting of live concerts. And I'm curious, like, how do you find that in terms of like what sorts of challenges are different doing the sort of live in-person format versus the radio format?
Live in person, if the joke landed. Live in person is a really different animal entirely. And the reason for that is like a pre-concert talk is 30 to 45 minutes. Introducing a piece of music on the radio is 30 to 45 seconds. So you have to be super concise on the radio. You have to decide which one thing you want to say about the music to connect people to it in that moment. You can tell a much more deeper, richer story about the music in a pre-concert talk. And I like both. I mean, we are a quick hitting society right now, and I like finding that one little nugget that can just like cause someone to perk up their ears and listen to a piece of music on the radio. But I also really like telling good detailed stories. And like in a pre-concert talk, if you've been to any that I do, at least, I like to have musical examples and say like, okay, here's what the composer is doing here, and here's why they did this, and this is an illustration of this. So obviously that's not something that you do on the radio really at all, unless maybe you want to introduce the Haydn Hen Symphony, and you grab that little clip from the opening movement that sounds like a hen, but you really don't. You don't do that on the radio, and you do get to do that in the live setting. So that's the biggest difference, is just the kind of story that you get to tell, and I like both.
Yeah, and I mentioned at the top that you and I are both resident artists with the Celestina Society, amazing chamber music group in LA. And I think it's so interesting. Like, I can't imagine there are many chamber music organizations that have a resident host and artistic partner in that particular way. So how did that come about, and how does that relationship work?
It has evolved a lot over time. Celestina is an amazing collection of musicians, as you know, Ben, but for those who don't know of this organization, they're just really forward-thinking, open-minded artists. And I don't know, Ben, if you're getting ready to link to them in the chat. Yes, perfect. So we started out, my relationship with them started out years ago, and we would do programs called Masterpiece Discovery, and it would be one big piece of chamber music. And that would be the second half of the concert. And the first half of the concert, I would talk about the piece of music. We would dissect down to the tiniest minutia, and the musicians would play examples of what we're talking about live. And then we would deconstruct the piece fully. And then the second half of the concert, we would put it back together. And that was a format that worked really well for a long time. And people really like to go deep into one piece of music. We sort of shifted away from doing that lately to just having a little more informal approach to what a concert is. So for example, like when you go to an orchestra concert, you know, the orchestra's there on stage and then a hush falls over the crowd and the concert master walks out and the oboe tunes the orchestra and then you got to clap at the right time and everything. Celestine is like, they walk out on stage whenever they feel like it. They talk to the audience before a concert starts and then we're like, okay, I guess we'll start now. And it gives this really like personable, intimate feeling that it works so well with chamber music. Should say this is not to say that the way orchestras do things are wrong. There's no wrong way to experience classical music. I strongly believe that. But I love the informality and the intimacy of what Celestina does. And so now, like my role as host and artistic partner there is to just guide people through a concert experience. We talk in between each piece, sometimes talk to the musicians. If we've got a composer there, we'll talk to the composer and just like really just try to demystify the music as much as possible, invite people in. And then the artistic partner side of things is just we get to have fun and talk about what we're going to program. And that's great.
Yeah, well, and one of my favorite programs that you guys have developed is the Sounds Mysterious. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's such a cool concept.
So this was, oh gosh, I don't even know whose idea this was, but whoever it was, brilliant. This was born out of the idea of like, so we had masterpiece discovery. Well, what is a masterpiece? Why are some pieces of music famous and some pieces aren't? And what if we stripped away all of our preconceived notions about who the great composers are and who the second and third tier composers are? What if we put on a concert where the audience shows up and we don't tell them anything about the music? We play the music and then we talk about it afterwards. And so they've now done a couple of these. One was an absolutely stunning piano trio by a composer that almost no one had heard of, but a piece of music that really deserved to be known as a masterpiece, but nobody plays it. Last season, actually, it was their last Celestina concert before everything shut down. We the experiment refined it even further and said, what if the musicians didn't know the piece they were playing? So they asked me to pick a piece of music and redact all of the information about the music, hand them just notes on a page with the composer's name scribbled out and see if the musicians approach the music in a different way if they don't know who wrote it or when it was written or anything about the piece of music. So we did that and had them try to guess at the end of the concert, who do they think wrote it? And I tried to pick like a really obscure piece of music, a good piece of music, but an obscure piece of music by a composer whose name most people would know. So I ended up finding this early piano quintet by Bartók, which is not Bartók's typical musical language. It's a really lush, romantic sounding piece of music by, of all people, Bartók. And wouldn't you know it, the musicians rehearsed it and played it, and they said, we think this sounds Hungarian, and we think it might be early Bartók, which I was like totally impressed. But the idea of just stripping away all context and saying like, we have so much bias in our experience of music, like, and would we listen to music differently if we had less bias? And I think the answer is obviously yes.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting concept, like you said, to then expand it so that even the musicians don't really know what the true context of it is, and it sort of really presents it in a very sort of blank canvas sort of way. Totally. So, you have been a champion for a while now of music of lesser known composers, and particularly women composers, composers of color. I'm curious who some of your favorite discoveries are and how you think the world of classical music is changing in terms of who gets a chance to have their music heard, or how we consume music in a way that would open up opportunities or close them, I guess, to various people.
Yeah, I'll start with the second half of that question first, I think. And it comes back to the fact that we all have biases. So like, there's nothing wrong with having a favorite composer, and there's nothing wrong if that favorite composer is a really famous name of a dead white guy. Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And there's no wrong way to experience classical music. However, there's an element of classical music that is so much based on gatekeeping, on who gets to have a voice in classical music. And this is true, like, I mean, Ben, you can talk about like how auditions work, right? And like who gets their voice heard, you know, from that standpoint, who gets to play. And it works that way with music too. And I always come back to the idea of greatness. And we didn't really talk about greatness in classical music until we got to the Romantic era, when, by its very title, we romanticized art and artists and the creators of art. And you read some of the old reviews of like Beethoven symphonies, and it's like the divine inspiration from on high flashed upon him, and he bestowed upon us this great masterpiece. Like, okay, that's one way of talking about that. That's one way of saying I really liked that symphony. Again, Beethoven writes great music, and I'm not saying at all that we should hear less of the quote unquote great composers, but there is room for more, in my opinion. And it's who deserves access to this space that we call classical music. What composers deserve to be heard, and who gets to decide those questions? And so, going way back to the beginning of our conversation, I'm curious. Like, I'm always curious. And so I want to know, like, who haven't I heard? And in so many cases, the people that I haven't heard are people from underrepresented groups. And I think there's so much incredible music out there that hasn't gotten heard, that it deserves to be heard, and it can be heard without coming at the expense of Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and Tchaikovsky. And I think that's the important point in all of this, is like, you can both champion underrepresented composers and love the quote unquote great composers, or the canonical composers. And I think, we live in such a binary world where it's like, well, it's either this or this. Like, no, both things can be true. Like, I can love and adore all of the Beethoven symphonies. I can think like Tchaikovsky 5 is just a total hoot. And I can also think that like we should play more William Grant Still, or Florence Price, or Margaret Bonds. And like both of these things can happen, as we heard on the Pacific Symphony like last season, when you had a program that had Gershwin and Florence Price and William Grant Still, and I can't remember the other, like with Aaron. Like, it can happen. We can play all of this music, and we just need to be curious, and we need to be open to it. And like, what's the worst that could happen with something that you don't know? You listen to something that you don't know. What's the absolute worst thing that can happen? You don't like it? Okay. Like, how long was that out of your life? A half hour? I'm sorry, bummer, right? Like, how many bad movies have we suffered through? And that's like 3 or 4 times as long. Like, so, I would just say, like, with respect to the unknown, is I always just encourage people to give it a shot, with an open mind. And you never know what you'll discover.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's also worth remembering that, the composers that we hear from, particularly classical and Baroque era, it's like there were so many more, and then they've been sort of filtered down. So we're hearing sort of like the best hits of them. So yeah, it's all a process of sort of learning and sort of seeing what you like, and supporting the ones that are truly, will stand the test of time.
Even someone like Telemann, whose music disappeared forever, and then they rediscovered it in the 1940s. Like, Telemann wasn't always known. Bach's music disappeared until Mendelssohn found it and was like, this seems like something we should hear. Like, Bach could have been gone forever if not for Mendelssohn. Telemann, we wouldn't have known Telemann if not for some music scholar rescuing music from a library that was about to get bombed in World War II. So, you know, it's not just composers from underrepresented groups. It's like, just be curious all across the board.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I wonder, so you sent me a performance of a piece that I was wondering, you know, it'll be sort of our closing clip before we all head back to the real world. Can you tell us a little bit about this composer and this piece?
Sure. With a tip of the cap to, I would much rather listen to this music than vice presidential debate. No, that's not true. I like to stay informed also, but no, this is a composer who was part of a group of composers known creatively as the Six. There were six of them. This is early 20th century French composer, and her name is Germaine Taillefer. And you know, I'm a big fan of this time period in France and all of the music that was being written during this time period. And there's Debussy and there's Ravel and there's Poulenc, and those are the big three names that a lot of people know. And so in my search for more music from this time, ran across, you know, this group called Les Six, the Six, and she was the only female member of that group. And she writes just staggeringly beautiful music. She has a great harp concerto, which is just an awesome piece of music. She's got a piano concerto. I wish she had symphonies, but you know, the French didn't write that many symphonies. She's got a lot of really wonderful chamber music. And so a couple of years ago, I had the Celestina musicians play this, just this slow movement from this piano trio at one of our performances. And it was just that one of those moments, I think for a lot of people, it was a moment for me for sure, and for a lot of people in the audience, of just to discover this hidden gem of beauty that none of us knew really existed. So this is music from 1917, and it's the slow movement of the piano trio by Germaine Taillefer.
Okay, let's take a listen.
It's got that little
Wow.
jazz there at the end.
So beautiful. And
Isn't that
hopefully it's
gorgeous?
inspired, I know it's inspired me to go check out more, and hopefully other people too. Brian, thank you so much for coming on. This has been just such a fun and fascinating hour. And yeah, just thank you.
Oh, my great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. And I think just my parting words are, I hope to see everyone in person as soon as it's possible and safe and all of that. But keep being inspired, keep being curious, keep listening, and hopefully, yeah, hopefully we'll be able to make some music together soon.
Amen to that. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Next week we have Alexander Romanovsky, the amazing pianist. So be sure to come back. And in the meantime, have a great week.
See ya.
Bye.